thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for inviting. And I know it's late, and it's Kant and late, which is not it's not the easiest thing. And that's why the talk is going to be on Kant and sexuality, because hopefully that, when you do the balance there, it's going to work out. Though many would say if you're going to do Kant and sexuality, it's 10 minutes and you'll all be asleep. So we just see, okay? So before I sort of go into the meat of the argument, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what the book is about, and so also when you do philosophy and you're trying to do the whole sexuality thing, you're trying to actually get a theory of sexuality, then there are many issues you want your theory to be able to speak to. Right? Obviously, everybody who sits down to try and do the book in the end kind of wants to have something new to say there or something that works to say there. But there's a whole set of issues that if you try the thing and write the theory, that you kind of have to try and struggle with. And so before I talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, these issues that such a theory will need to speak to today. And then I'll zoom in on what we are going to talk about in particular. Hopefully the aim is a little bit to show, on the one hand, why pretty much everyone who came after Kant and who say that the reason why they're not Kantians is because they can't doing something so much better. Why I think, well, that's not so obvious, right? So Kant is usually much more interesting, even when he makes mistakes, which I'm going to argue that he does. They are very interesting mistakes, and they are not usually where these mistakes are being put by those who come after, whether it's Fichte, Sartre, Hegel, and so on and so forth. And so also today's talk then, since this is the talk in the unit, I'm going to focus on one of these areas of Kant where postmodern theory tends to think that Kant has nothing to say. So to show that actually he's cooler than that. But first, before I go there, then let me just show you a little bit about the structure of such a theory, and then so that you can zoom in on where I'm going to talk. And also, but you can also see what, if you want to ask about other things, you can see why, but you can also see why they kind of are something else than what I've been talking about. But all is up for questions. So if you try and do a theory of a philosophical theory of sexuality, and then sexuality is understood sort of broadly, like everything we put in there. So it's going to be issues like having sex, it's going to be issues like gender, it's going to be legal issues, and so on and so forth. So if you want to do that, the first thing to try and figure out is what's the structure, which areas do you need to cover? And I believe Kant's suggestion in that area, well, you have to do at least four things. One is you need an account of what we can call moral psychology, which is tied to an account of human nature. Then you need account of what he will call, or we call often today, or rather, philosophical. I did it in Norwegian here. I'll do it in English. Anthropology. In other words, we need an account of the kinds of natures we have. What kind of a being is it that we have, which is going to be informative for everything else. So you somehow need an account of what human nature is, right? And then you need an account, if you want to get all the way to sexuality, you're going to need an account that also deals with the phenomena of gender. So this way in which sexuality, there's something about aspects of it that is inherently social in nature. So you can't have a complete theory if you don't do that. So you need moral psychology, which in some important sense then looks at what it is to be a human being, sort of an account of that. Then you need an account of that is consistent but doing different work in the theory of the sociality, right, such that we end up with things like gender. So that's a whole bunch of issues over there, and the kinds of issues that actually a lot of theories coming after Kant thinks that he has nothing to say. And most of my talk today is going to be on those issues. In addition, though, you need an account, if you want a theory, what Kant would call an ethics, which is sort of first personal morality. So what I ought to do, right? You need an account of that. And since I'm not going to talk much about that today, I'll hint at it and stuff and I'll point to it, but it's not the core of the talk. This is probably what, if you have done any Kant at all, this is likely what you have learned. So you probably, if you've done only a tiny bit of Kant, you've read the groundwork. And you know that Kant has something called the categorical imperative. And you know he has an account of imperfect and perfect duties. I'll talk a little bit about them later, but not much, and depending a little bit on how fast it goes. So, the categorical imperative for Kant is his account of the moral law, the principle we always sort of orient ourselves by, and the way in which it makes it possible for us to be moral. And it's going to be involving an account of perfect duties, duties we always have, and then imperfect duties, which are duties that they always have a call on us, but they are things we can set aside in various circumstances. In addition to that, and then you have to apply this, put it like, then you have to apply this to ethics, to sexuality. So what it is I have a duty or not a duty to do with regard to sexuality, somehow you're going to have to talk to that. Are there things I ought to do, and are there things I ought never to do, and so on and so forth, right, with regard to anything in sexuality. Finally, if you do the whole count, according to Kant, you need an account of what he calls right, because, you know, he wrote in German, Recht, but you can also say just justice, or the law. And in sexuality, again, you're likely never to have heard about this. So until about 20 years ago, nobody really read this stuff. And so it's one of those fun things in the last 20 years, is suddenly people realize this, not just an ethics for Kant, but it's also a theory of law, and it's fantastic. Of course, everything Kant did was fantastic, right? And just to remind you of that one, he is the most amazing philosopher ever to have walked the planet. That's just a fact. That's not one of those we can really discuss. There's facts and then there's facts. Yes? Okay. Now, according to Kant, if we want to give an account of the law with regard to sexuality, then there will be three areas you have to be able to talk to, namely things about our body and about speech, which are innate right for Kant. There are various kinds of rights you are born with. You don't have them importantly before you're born, but you are born with them. And so when it comes to sexuality, it will be things like why, and to give an account of why, if I do not with sexuality, when I leave that piece of chalk there and you take it, you steal from me. If I hold it in my hand and you take it, you commit battery. And then that is tied to an account of, for example, of rape, right? So why it is the case that when somebody's raping me, that's not a similar type of wrong as when you steal from me. It's much worse. And then there's speech, which in the US is often where the law is found when it comes to pornography, right? Because it's speech that has to do with sexuality. So there's a lot of legislation around pornography. And so you need an account. If you want a full theory, you need to have an account of pornography, what that is. So this is called innate right for Kant, which is born with type of right. Then he has an account of private right that you have to make relevant. And in this context, there's especially two things that are important, and that is contracts and marriage. So contracts, because it will be perhaps part of an account of if we can sell sexual services, right? So what's that whole phenomenon about? Can I sell them, or should it be illegal to sell them? Can it not be a contract? And even if you say that there could be a contract, is it enforceable, right? Including given this theory, but also is it true? Could it, even if you allow that it should be legal, can it be enforceable or not? If your answer is not, which I think is the right answer, is not enforceable, then does it mean that it necessarily must be illegal? Then marriage is naturally a big deal on this account, including what would be Kant's argument or the Kantian-based argument for why it was, for example, important for same-sex couples to have the right to marry. Why is it important to have a right to marry? And then finally, so that's part of the account. And then finally, you need an account of public right. So private right is what becomes private law. And public right becomes public law. And so private right has all to do about private relations between individuals, but legally, right? And public law, in contrast, is all about systemic claims. So on this account, and we don't want to talk much about it, but Kant denies that all that the law does is just to enforce private relations. So there are certain claims we have on the state that we don't have with regard to one another. And there are certain duties that the state have that individuals don't have. And then I argue, and people have to deal with, usually, this is the context, so systemic right. So issues that are inherently systemic in nature. And somehow the state has to do something or has, on this type of account, special obligations because it's establishing a monopoly on coercion governed by law. And so it gets certain systemic obligations. And this is where you will start not the discussion around not just the selling of sexual services or buying of sexual services, but this is where you would put on this account and where what one needs to do if one wants a theory to talk about the institution of prostitution. Right? So you can get prostitution, and then I use prostitution as the institution of what actually goes on in the selling of sexual and buying of sexual services today, where it's not the case that just any social group is likely to end up in the industry. Right? So what does the industry look like? And what would be the laws to regulate such an industry? And the same thing about pornography. So then the switch is from just sort of from speech and from sale of sexual and buying of sexual services to a discussion of the industry. What do we do about the systemic issues that are involved when it comes to sexuality? So a fairly complete theory, at least if it wants to talk to all the issues that are discussed in the philosophy of sex and love, it has to have all of this stuff in place, right? And in addition, somehow this has to fit together as a theory. So it has to be the case that your account over here, what a human being is, right, is complemented by your account of what sociality or anthropology, culture, looks like, this social aspect of us, which has to be complemented by your account of what I ought and ought not to do as a morally good, virtuous person, right, which again should be complemented by what it is that we do with the law, what we can force people to do in the name of respecting other people's rights, and here, right to freedom ultimately. So if the theory is going to make sense, all of these bits do their own, we say, philosophical work. They do their own work in the theory, but then they complement each other, right? So that's the aim of the theory, to get all of these bits worked out so they can critique, say, the laws we find it, virtue, what we do when we claim that you ought to do that, what it is that we see when we look at culture and the various ways in which people act socially, such as gender presentations, yeah? And finally, what kind of beings we are. all of it has to sort of just complement each other in one whole. With my students, I like to think of it so when you work with these old theories, right? So these very complex theories, whether it's Hegel or Kant or whatever, Aristotle, these absolutely fantastic theories also in that they try to do all of this. They all try to do all of this. And so the way to think about how it all fits, to me, is like my favorite metaphor is to think of like when you see the universe. So you see all these planets and stars, and they actually make out one thing. So part of what the imagination keeps on doing as you're reading and working is to see how it can all fit. So which planets are closer to others, and how when you move from one planet to the other one, and how it makes up a whole. They give sort of a complete critique. Then, my favorite way of sort of trying to get at what I'm now going to try and make you all do is to try and see some of the details, right? So I'm not going to do the details over there much. I'm going to focus on the details here, right? What is Kant's account of what kind of beings we are? Such that we also end up with the sexuality. What's this account of gender? How does it work? And then I'm going to argue that there are some mistakes in the argument. And if he had seen them where he should, if he had argued what he should have argued, which is always one's favorite argument against any philosopher, what you should have argued, given your own premises, is what I'm going to argue, right? And if you had argued that, then you get a very good theory, at least a starting point. So we move to a different level of mistakes, at least, right? Which is nice. But then the task, right, of trying to imagine all of this. So again, it's my favorite way to explain it to students. So the thing I want you to be able to do is to just do philosophy. I don't know if you've ever seen sort of one of these prints. There's sort of just one pattern. And then if you have like a glass or something, you see it in the right way, then suddenly it goes into 3D. Okay, it's like that. So if I do it well and you do your bit, then hopefully it goes into 3D, right? So hopefully you can say, oh, I see. That's how it all comes together. Yeah, which also means that like if there was a step you didn't get, then it's totally say, oh, I didn't get that. Because then we just do that one more time, and then hopefully there it is. So let me start with the human nature thing. So what kinds of beings are we? Which is basically the account. What kinds of ways in which is it that we are conscious and aware and being in the world, such that human life opens up as it does? And ultimately, we want that to be explaining a basic subjective, like from my point of view, the phenomenology involved in being a human being, what it feels like in various ways, and the ways in which we can and cannot control what things feels like. Yes? And ultimately, we want to have that account go all the way to explain why it is that we are kinds of beings that can be morally responsible for what we do. We're the only beings we have met so far in the universe that actually are able to be responsible for our actions, right? To do wrong in that way. You ought not to have done that. In other words, how is it possible for you to say to each other, it's like, that was wrong, you shouldn't have done that. And then for you to say, I know, I really shouldn't have. But you cannot say it to your dog or your cat or the chimp or the elephant. You cannot do that. It would be cruel to the animal, to hold the animal responsible in that way. So what is it about the kinds of beings we are such that we can understand an ought, that I ought to do something? So, here we go. Kant argues that if you want to look at human nature, important ways, we can think of it as sort of threefold in nature. So there are three aspects of our conscious being that you can distinguish from each other, because they're not the same. And he calls the least complex in some ways, but very emotionally strong, animality. So anything that has that component is a living being, technically speaking. So philosophical, technical talk, plants aren't alive. Okay? Only animals are alive. In this way he wants. That is, only animals are conscious. So he ties living to conscious right now. So if you have that, if you are a living being such in this way, then Kant argues it will be true that already from the moment you are born, there will be 3 ways in which you are consciously oriented in the world. There are 3 things that are there as you come out that he calls animality. It's self-preservation, it's the sex drive, and it was called basic community. So when you have a little baby and it comes out, right? There it is. And it's sort of lovely, and Kant, like Simone de Beauvoir, is very influenced by Rousseau. So you can imagine how, when you are inside, at least until sort of late stages, is really lovely, right? Because it's perfect temperature, and you're floating. All your needs are met, and you just sort of, it's so nice, yeah? Awesome. And there's a deep sense in which you sort of feel at one with the world, right? There's a sense in which there isn't a distinction between you and anything else. Because you're kind of just floating around. You never felt a need, really, right? You're not aware of yourself in that way. So there's something very, very, very delicious about it. In fact, it's so delicious that it may be one of the things that feed some people's imaginations about death. It's like that again. It's at one again. Oh, all the needs are gone. It's lovely. So that's the imagination, yeah? So if you look at then the baby comes out, and then chop, 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 right? Right? And you can feel your needs for the first time. You cut up and suddenly you're hungry, right? And you're distinct. So whoa, so it's very, very, very scary. So here I am now, I'm distinct from someone, and I can feel things. So coming out is sort of profoundly disorienting. So when the baby screams, part of what those screams are about is like feeling needs for the first time. But then importantly, notice, what do we do? Well, one thing we do, and commonly done, it's not the only thing, but various ways to have the same psychological effect, we put the baby on the mother or on the parent. And what happens? It calms the baby. So you want your theory to be able to explain, why does it calm the baby? The baby can't think yet. It can't think, oh gosh, isn't that lovely, right? It can't do any of that. So how come it works? You want the theory to explain why it works. And Kant is following those who argue, well, because the baby comes out with a sort of a basic conscious orientation towards community, to feeling, again, at peace, just like you were inside when you put it on the body and you talk and you remind the body of what, oh, it's the same. Is that good thing just different-ish? But he doesn't think that, right? But that's why it works. If there wasn't an uptake, it wouldn't work, right? And if you want that uptake to be something like, oh, it can think about it, that clearly seems very implausible because babies don't think in that way. It also responds to sensuous touch, right? The baby, we touch them, we stroke and we kiss and we do all these kinds of things. And it works. It calms them, makes them happy, makes them feel safe. They respond to it. We're not just doing it, right? We're doing it because it actually works. And then we stimulate a little bit to make them realize, oh, how to get this hunger thing happening, right? It takes a little bit and then a little encouragement, and then they suck. And then they suck until they're full, right? And then they take up the extra. So on this account, you want this stuff, Kant would argue, not to require reason as such. So you want your account of human beings and that these things work, these things that are deeply tied to these three natural ways in which we are consciously oriented in the world. You don't want them to appeal to reason, our ability to think about things and figure things out, because it's already there. And in fact, not only is it already there, but it's also there in beings, other animals, who do it in a different way. They think in a different way. They're not able to think like we do. But they also respond to being picked up. And they're also trying to survive. And they respond. So there's a sense in which we share it with all animals. Right? So that's his lowest level. The second level he calls humanity. Humanity. So now we're starting what is distinguishing our types of being from other kinds of beings. There are two parts of this, he argues, and that is paying attention to how human beings, quite early on, it's very important, is able to have a social. I'm really keen on speaking Norwegian today. I'm going to Norway tomorrow, maybe why. Social sense of self and rational end setting. So let's do that one, yeah? So do the social sense of self first. It's also the one we find in other thinkers, right? Including, of course, Simone de Beauvoir, who is also inspired by Rousseau, which is where Kant has a lot of this from. He just does it in his way. But if you go back to the baby, so it doesn't take, so you have this little love fest in the beginning, which really is all about pouring affection and tending to physical needs and just making the baby feel comforted, right? You don't wean the baby in the first period. Every time there's a squeak, you kind of tend to it, right? You're not weaning it off anything. So it's basically sort of reinforcing this sense of being safe in the world, right? At the very sort of pre-reflective level. That's what you're doing. But then somewhat coinciding with when that sort of little changing the diaper thing is becoming more fun for parents, which is kind of when that baby is starting to really interact back, right? Starting to flirt with you in a sense, wanting your attention, and knowing that it's seen by you. So you come, it's starting to smile, like, oh, the most awesome thing ever. And that's you, right? And then you want to show the baby that the baby is the most awesomest thing ever. So it's this super love fest, right? The pee is flying, the poop is everywhere, and that in the middle, you are having this amazing, or you are the most amazing thing ever. And for those of us who have friends with little babies at the moment, is the one that's tracking like 7,000 pictures on Facebook. Because every time there's a new movement, you have to tell everybody because it is the most amazing baby ever. And that's part of like becoming also an us with a baby, right? You are in that way so ridiculously emotionally open to that little being. But what you are affirming then, notice that. So what you are actually stimulating in paying attention so much to that little baby, now I'm going to illustrate it to you. So some of you are going to be a little bit uncomfortable, but now I'm going to stop. And so when I stop and look at you, you become very self-conscious. Yeah? Which is why when we give talk, one doesn't look a long time at people, because as soon as you do, it becomes so enormously uncomfortable to be there. And you can't even think, right? But notice that what I am doing then is I'm just showing to you how it is that you actually have a sense of being seen. Yes? So what you are in this sort of discomfort thing happening is the same thing that is not like that when the one looking at you is like a very good friend. So the people I know quite well in here, I can look at it a little while before, right? And smile back and all that stuff, which is because people whom we love, so people who are close to us, when we look at them, we affirm them, just like you do with the little babies. So the whole sort of pouring, aren't you the most amazing thing? Hey, right? I always do Kant with them. And then they smile at the right places. And it's like, exactly, isn't it awesome? Yeah, right? So when that is happening, then the baby gets a sense of importance, that it matters, it is seen, and it's worth being attended to, right? And so it gets a sense of self, and you are enabling it. So what also your friends do is they give you a sense of who you are, because they reflect you back, yeah? Now, it seems, and Kant might have been aware of that, because he had a huge fascination with elephants, which, you know, good philosophical minds, these beings are just really philosophically interesting. It was an analgons of humans. There's something about elephants, right? But anyway, so it seems that some elephants and dolphins and chimps, they also have some of this. And how can we know that? Well, actually, the way in which they do test these things, so one way to test it, is that without that elephant or chimp or dolphin knowing it, you just put a little mark on them. And then you put a mirror up. And so they don't know that there's a mark. That's the clever trick. And then you put the mirror up, and they look in the mirror, and then they start looking for the mark. You can only do that if you can relate to an image of yourself. So most animals don't do that, non-human animals, right? So you put your dog up for the 50th time, because my dog, if you have Facebook friends with dogs, that's the other one, is thousands of pictures, right? But it doesn't happen in that way. Dogs are like love balls down here, right? It's pure affection. If you want to be loved, that's where it is. But they don't have that one. They can't relate to an image of themselves. Cats can't either. And, you know, our pets in general can't do that. But we can, and it's very important for the kind of being we are. And Kant thinks that you couldn't do this if you couldn't also then, on the one hand, relate to an image of yourself, but also sort of think of yourself as distinct from somebody else. So you have to be able to compare you and others. So if your reason, your mind couldn't do that, you couldn't do this thing. So it says comparative uses of reason is necessary. But then importantly too, not only can we do that, and so it seems like some other beings can do some of that, but then it's the thing that really, according to Kant, is the clue that ultimately is tied to why it is we can go all the way up and also have personality. So let me start with this one. So we're back to the baby, yeah? So you've gone a bit longer, and you want your theory to explain a few funky facts about human beings, right? So why is it the case that it takes us unbelievably long to get up on those legs, like a year? You say, well, you know, we have very long legs. Well, yeah, baby horses, they have much longer legs, and it takes them about half an hour, you know. There they are. Not only are they up on those legs, but they run. It's like, hey, awesome, right? It takes us like 12 months to pretty much be able to do that thing. And then notice what it is that we do when we do that, right? We're teaching our little superstar, right, how to walk. So, it's little Helga now. So I should do this in Norwegian, because that's how Helga did it. So, I'll do it first in English. Helga wants to go to mommy. So we'll do it in Norwegian. Helga går til mamma. Ja, Helga går til mamma. Come, Helga går til mamma. And then, awesome, right? It's the most fun thing. And so you keep going there. And notice there are many funky things going on. On the one hand, you keep on saying, Helga wants to go to mommy. You don't say you. You say, Helga wants to go to mommy. Yeah? And at some point, Helga starts to be able to walk across the floor to mommy. Yeah? And it's so fun. So she keeps, you know, doing it. There's no non-funness about this one. And then, now she's walking quite well, right? And then Uncle, take a real uncle, Martin comes in and says, oh, look, Helga is walking to mommy. what happens? Down she goes. Wait, boom. Why is it so common that you actually fall if somebody sort of interrupts you halfway across your stride as you're learning to walk, right? Have that moment like, down you go. Why? What is going on? What is it that we're trying to do, in other words, that can explain why we're different from other animals, why we do it with like Helga in this way when we're teaching it, and why is it possible to interrupt it in that kind of way? And Kant's story is the story about, because human beings, we act on something he calls maxims. And maxim is a subjective rule of action. Now I'm going to explain. Subjective meaning that when I am learning, in contrast to other animals, when human beings are learning to do things, to act, to perform actions, then they are trying to organize their minds around certain principles that governs what they are doing. They're trying to get the whole being to consciously focus on what he calls a rule of action, something that's going to guide everything that happens from now to over there, to the end. Helga walking to mummy. So the reason why we keep on saying Helga walking to mummy, oh, there you go, mummy, come on, Helga walking to mummy, is that you're reminding the baby what the baby is doing and helping it in its effort to be able to govern all of this, right, by the mind and make it actually do this thing. Yes? And once it succeeds, it's able to do that. Like all the main activities as I walk across are actually governed by this way in which I'm focusing my mind. I'm focusing on doing it. I'm not just doing it, right, in some way that doesn't involve, it involves me trying to do it. And the reason why the baby doesn't say, or we don't say, do you want to do it yet? Is because the baby is not yet able to think of itself as doing it. It's not able to relate to itself as an I am doing it. So we talk for a long time with the baby as with the name because it can't think of itself as I yet. And the baby can still not think about what it is doing and still do it. And that's what you need to be able to do. You need to be able to do what you're trying to do, be able to think about what you're doing as you're doing it, and then be able to think that I am doing it. So you need it to be possible for it to be a subjective rule of action, so something I as a subject am doing right now. So you can do anything you're doing right now. You can be writing now, right now. Then you can notice that you can be writing, thinking about the fact that you're writing, continue to write, and think that you are writing. And those two things Kant is suggesting no other animals are able to do. They're not able to think about what they're doing as they're doing it in that way, and that they are doing it. That I am doing this right now. So far, so good? Yeah? Sort of-ish? Let me do one more and see if that helps.
Is that rational and setting the one you just did?
Close, yeah. It's learning, it's almost rational at this point, right? It's end setting as humans have them, right? Because notice that once I can think about what I'm doing in that I am thinking about it, the space opens up and I can do something else. Yeah. So when I'm thinking, oh, I don't know, today I'm gonna go to the movies, right? Or I can think about what I'm doing right now. I can also choose to do something else, right? So I can just, like right now, like just change my mind all the time. And it's because I'm able to think about what I am doing and that I am doing it, that I can do that. Animals, other animals, are not able to do that. They're not able to think about what they're doing as they're doing it and think that they are doing it. And so they can't just set new kinds of ends. Because if you can't have that distance to what you're doing or this consciousness about what you're doing, thinking about what you're doing, then you can't also have that space like, and I'm going to do something else. So you don't have, beavers that suddenly is, I'm so sick and tired of this pond. I've been swimming back and forth here with that stupid other beaver over there. It's like, I'm just going to do differently. I'm going to go to California, and I'm just going to hang out with some other beings because I'm tired of this thing. And I'm tired of doing these beaver things. Yeah? Human beings don't have one thing to do. So we have rational ends in that our ends are open-ended. We do new things all the time. Right? So part of what we do is the fact that I can just do differently. And because I can do differently, there isn't a beaver kinds of ends for human beings. Now, since we can do all of that, right, the rational thing of it, and this might be a bit much, but importantly for Kant, which is how it ties over to those of you who have done here, Kant thinks then that we can do something more with this, which is why ultimately we are rational beings, and also ultimately why we can be morally responsible. Because not only can I think about what I'm doing and what I want to do, but then I can think about whether or not doing this thing is consistent with everybody else getting to do what they want to do. So it's possible for me, Kant thinks, that's how our minds work. Then when I'm considering whether or not something is right or wrong, I can consider whether or not this rule I'm acting on could hold as a law for rational beings. Is there anything in what I am doing that necessarily makes it impossible for some other human being to do what they want to do? Necessarily. And if the answer is yes, you can, then it's morally permissible. If the answer is no, you can't do it. And Kant is sort of a quick, now I'm doing the quick thing because I want to move on. But the argument is then all actions that involve aggression, right, either towards others or to yourself, your mind will say no to. And the reason is that in aggression, any maximum, whether it's hitting people, killing, stealing, lying, all these things, you can never justify doing them. Because necessarily when you do, the reason why your mind doesn't allow you to say that's okay, that's a good thing, is because necessarily is it the case that somebody else do not get to do what they want to do if you do it. One illustration, if I take up this one and throw it at you right now, you can't choose what to do because you're going to have to protect yourself. Yeah? And so according to Kant, our minds are brilliant in that you cannot ever justify to yourself being the exception to the rule. And for Kant, it's similar to how when we do science proper, you can, if you're doing a scientific experiment and you find one exception to the rule, you know you didn't find the law. Our minds do the same with morality. It checks whether this rule you have, this hypothesis, the one thing you want to do, whether it could be the law or if it's necessarily the exception to the law. If it's necessarily the exception to the law, then you can't justify it as a law. So you can only lie if there's truth, right? Lying presupposes truth. It can't be, it's always necessarily the exception to the rule. It can't be the rule. So your mind functions the same way. Kant thinks. It looks for which rules, when it looks very strictly at whether or not I can do it, is whether or not it could hold as a law, or if it's necessarily the exception to the law. And that's perfect duties for Kant. Okay. And then the funny thing about human beings is that the nature we have has something called moral feeling, which is basically what I'm describing right now. So when you realize that you ought not to do something that is wrong, then that gives you a reason not to do it. It produces its own incentive for you. And only human beings, as far as we know, can do that. So you can do something just because it's the right thing to do. Regardless of what you feel like doing, you can do it just because it's right. Or you cannot do something just because it's wrong. You can fail, but you can do it. Which shows that the way in which we are conscious beings, embodied conscious beings, is such a way that it's responsive to the way you reason. And so it makes you, if you do something that you shouldn't do, you feel bad. You have a conscience. the feeling. It feels painful, right? When you're ashamed of yourself or you're embarrassed for what you did, right? It feels bad. That's the kind of being you are. You can actually feel bad about that. When you did the right thing, it feels good. You feel it's a good thing. So you have a special kind of feeling, which he calls moral feeling. So the kind of valuing that human beings have that no other ones have. And that's why we can be persons or responsible. Okay, then the last one. I think I have about 10 minutes left, right? Okay. So that's basically Kant's account then of the nature we have as such. So this way in which we are embodied beings, if we just look at this sort of phenomenology of it, the various ways in which we have some structures, these structures are tied with a view in ways in which we are conscious, what we can and cannot do. And it also explains why the nature of the emotions at each level. So this level, this lower level here, which doesn't require reason, right? So something, even though for human beings, we develop our humanity, our animality by setting ends and making things complex, yes? It's still the case that these kinds of the emotions you find down here, they are importantly, emotionally very strong. They're not easy for us to control with our minds. They're not inherently, we would say, reflective. That is, there's something about them that is given to us, right? With something about them that we find ourselves with a feeling, and we can still be responsible for them, but there's something about them that's inherently unreflective, right? To give an example, I'll do this one. When you find, basic community, when you find yourself falling in love, there's a profound sense in which finding yourself open to somebody like that, or finding yourself drawn to them in that way, right, is not something you can just choose, right? There's all these nice people you wish you could fall in love with, right? And then it's just not happening, right? You try, it's such a nice guy, you tell yourself, right? Really nice, well, she's so nice. Yeah, but it's just not happening, right? And let alone this thing. Like, I really don't want to have sex with that person. And it's not because I think you're very nice and all kinds of things, but I really don't, it's not happening again, right? I don't want to share my life with that person, or I don't want to have sex with them, right? And so there's something unchosen about it. There's something very, very strong, but it's not something you just choose to do. You learn to be responsible, right, and deal with this nicely, in nice ways, but you break people's hearts. I mean, there's a sense in which there's no nice way to do that, because the effect, again, is so big. Your heartbroken is like, whoa, right? It's so painful, and it doesn't matter to just think about it. You just have to sort of find a way through it, right? Which involves a lot of sadness, right? Because it wasn't possible. It's very, very sad. So we learn to be responsible, but they're not things we just choose about. So that's the nature of these things, yeah? There's something, but they're very strong. And similarly then to this one, when somebody we love die, then we don't choose to grieve. We find ourselves grieving. But what really is grieving? Well, on this account, is sort of finding yourself a bit afloat. So somebody who gave you a sense of who you are, somebody who made you feel safe in the world, despite all the evidence to the contrary, is suddenly not there anymore. And so you're a bit afloat. And so you go through this very important way in which this person has been for you, but there's a deep sense in which you're letting yourself feel it, right? It's part of how you actually grieve. And that can be to feel joy and sadness, but it is sort of finding a way and moving through all of that to be you, but having lost a part of you, right? There's a deep sense in which a part of you is a memory for you only now, not one that can be shared. So, moving up here then. This one involves reason, but it's still, especially this one then, is somewhat unruly. Yeah? So this one is where you find on Kant culture. I'm just linking over here. Culture, which is funky. So, this way involves comparing oneself. So when we do it really well, if you go back to the baby, then when your baby just like when your good friends do well in life, it fills you with joy. Yeah? Every accomplishment, which explains some of the thousands of pictures on Facebook too, right? It's much joy you experience in every single step, right? That's part of what the psychology of it is. Now, but it's also the case, right, that this funny thing is one of them very unruly. Grad school is full of it, for those of you in grad school. There's a deep sense in which I'm now telling you the truth. You're going to be friends for the rest of your life. So each time you feel envy when the other one is doing well, or happy makes you feel unhappy, right? Why do you come in, somebody's so happy, oh, I feel terrible now, right? I had a good day off. You got a paper accepted, the conference, off, right? So that's this way in which others can make you feel, right? You give it up because they are your friends for life. You're not really competing, right? But there's these social emotions like envy, jealousy, schadenfreude, like all these kinds of things that are inherently social, like my standing relative to others. Yeah? And that's all here. This is then freedom, right, for Kant, ultimately, this ability we have to set ends of our own. And it's part, for Kant, also part of why the baby screams, because it can't yet set ends. So it's some of that screaming is, I want to do things and they can't. Yes? So when you then try and move over here to the philosophical anthropology of it, this is super important because there's a deep sense in which that is how I present and being read in the world. Now, if we have all these pieces, and I'm doing it fast now because I have 5 minutes, yeah? If we have all these pieces in place, then we can start explaining sexuality on Kant's view. So both his, and then I'll tell you what the mistake is, and then Q&A. If Kant is right about this basic picture, then if you want to explain things like why sex is so exciting, a lot of what it is to have sex, good sex, what it is to fall in love, and so on and so forth, well, you find it down here. So it involves a lot of this. Yes? So if you want to have good sex, for example, you can't think about it all the time. There's part of learning to have good sex is to learn to be in such a situation that you don't need to think about all the time what you're doing. Right? The sort of the letting go, so-called thing. Similarly, like falling in love with someone is to be emotionally open in this way, right? And we have it to particular people in important ways. We can unhook these things, but we have it to particular people. There's a way in which then Kant argues that they complement us. Yes? And when things go well in a good story, and so with the people who love us in various ways, in good ways, then they give us a very sort of confident sense of self. We feel safe, right? And we are right in feeling safe, and we feel that we're becoming more of who we are, and that the other person is actually enabling that to happen. Yeah? And if it's going well in the social world too, then the social world affirms who you are. Right? There's no resistance in an important way. It's more like affirmation. And then to add a little argument here, Kant argues that when we do this, and then we do it all the way, we do all of this, and then we add to it, which is part of this amazing thing about human sexuality, we add an application of the beautiful and the sublime. And I do the speed explanation of that. So human beings don't only have this, but as we try and develop all of this into one being, me, who I am, and as I also am engaging others, whether it's socially or intimately, which differs, I use the principles of the beautiful or the sublime. I present myself in such a way that I'm attractive, right? And Kant argues, and here comes his version, and then I'll fix it. He argues that men, they tend to use this principle, the sublime, yes? And so they are the takers, they are the ones that are forceful, right? Or if you look at the ways in which they then present in the world, they have simple colors, not a lot of dish dash, right? So sort of like that. Or if you want a tomboy, you look a bit like this, right? So that's a woman, but who's very tomboy, who always climbed trees and, you know, fought with the boys. And there's something about my way of being that has that element in it that would be called sublime here. Whereas people are much more on the femme side, for Kant that's women, they have more that sort of alluring attractiveness, this play of colors, this way in which is sort of many things moving rather than something whoosh, like that. So it's the one that is alluring and then something is drawn to it. And that's the way in which we use the beautiful and sublime in our embodiment. We both do it socially, but also, of course, personally and intimately. Now, Kant ended up with heterosexism. You know, it was two genders, divides in this way, you know, all the way. Traditional genders, two of them, and so on and so forth. It's psychologically interesting, and you can ask me about why he did that, because his theory doesn't actually allow it. And his theory doesn't allow it because, in contrast to all the things you find over there, the freedom stuff, which is Kant's freedom theory, his ethics and his theory of right, he thinks you can prove that stuff. This involves principles, the categorical imperative, and various principles of private right, innate right, public right. They are principles of freedom. And I can prove the truth of them to be objectively true. I can prove it. It's possible to deduce them. And he thinks that you can prove them to be a priori and objectively true. This stuff is not like that, according to Kant. For those of you who have done a lot of Kant, this is second critique. A lot of that stuff is third critique. And the third critique, the critique of judgment, or all the stuff I had talked about here, it is not possible, according to Kant's own system, to think of you as, or what you're presenting as you can prove it to be objectively true. He doesn't think it's possible. So there's a sense in which this stuff over here can be proven wrong. And in fact, because it can be proven wrong, he got that one right, you can't set the framework, because if you let that stuff set the framework for freedom, then you set something that is you can't really prove to be objectively true, set the framework for what you can prove to be true, so you have to do it the other way around. So when we create just societies, or we interact respectfully, then we create that framework within which we give people space, in his own theory, to be who they are and to prove what they, and show us what they want to show us, and so on and so forth. But you can't prove that there are only two genders. In fact, or that the genders line up like he does it. In fact, in a lot of his theory, when he's in the right place about this stuff, you know, you can't really even know how much of this theory is right or not right until for a long time you've had conditions of freedom. Because only, he argues, when you've had a long time with conditions of freedom, is it the case that you can see what is actually possible for human beings. So you don't mistake what you thought was impossible for what is actually possible. And so, also on his account, the effort in many ways, both on what we can enforce and how we interact respectfully, is what sets the framework. And then this stuff and the diversity that's going to come here is going to happen by itself if it is to happen. And I think we have pretty good evidence already in societies that are trying to do this, even if terribly imperfectly. This is all you have to do, and suddenly there it comes. And a much more fun, complex story with the same elements are present. Thank you very much. Have a go at it. Even if it's the question, I didn't get that. Yeah.
I'm curious about in the very beginning we talked about love and sex and that the concept is not enforceable. I'm just curious as to what that's all about.
Yeah. Well, I think on this account, so one straightforward reason, right? So that doesn't use any of that stuff over there. I think on this account it can't be enforceable, because on this account, what it is to be We are embodied beings, right? And see if this is too fast, but then you just say, whoa, hold on. So from the point of view, for Kant, from the point of view of law, what we are looking at is how to interact in space and time, in the world, in such a way that we respect each other's rights. Yeah? And notice that from that point of view, you and your person is the same. There's no distinction between you and your person. Notice when I argued over here, I was saying all these kinds of things, appealing to what you can do in your mind and so on and so forth. Can you do all of this, la, 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 right? You can imagine all kinds of accounts according to which maybe there's a rational soul in you or something like that. Yeah? I can give arguments for that. But it is the case that when I'm now looking at you as you are in the world, I can't see your soul. Yes? I can't. Because even whatever I'm appealing to that, including your reflective abilities, the things you can do with your mind, from the point of view of space and time, from the point of view of what I can see in the world, you and that is one. I can't make a distinction. So Kant argues that even though religion sometimes, or even though ethics or this stuff, uses these distinctions between bits of you that are just matter, and bits of you, the way in which you are conscious and how this sort of makes up who you are, from the point of view of law, that's not the case. And then he comes. On this account, the starting point always, if I'm to justify what I'm doing, right, just state, it has to be, in order for you to feel the obligation, it has to be the case that we start from each of us have a right to be free. Yes? Why should you, if I say to you, or you say to me, whatever, you say, I'm going to have a right to be free, to do what I want to do, to be a rational being, but not you. Why would I care why would I be obliged? Like, no, right? There would be no reason for me to want to do that. I might have to do that if you forced me to, but I wouldn't be obliged to do it. So if we're in a reasonable world, the starting point is, the conversation starts only if we have a right to be free. And Kant thinks that have a right to be free means that I have a right to be independent in my exercise of my choices from your choices. You don't get to choose which ends I get to set. That's part of what it is to be free. Yes? So Kant argues that the contrast with the right to freedom is enslavement for Kant. So enslavement exactly is that one doesn't have that right. And then, as I read him arguing, that is also why I can never have enforceable rights to your body. Because you're an embodied person, if I have enforceable rights to your body, then I have a right to enslave you. To subject you, your embodied person, to my choices, and I don't. Kant thinks you don't even have a right to that in marriage. So he's one of the first ones to give an argument for why there is marital rape. There couldn't be. I could never get a right to subject another person, from the legal point of view as your embodied person, to my choices in that way. And so I take it on this account, or that's what I'm tempted by anyway. So even if you can argue, if we set aside all these systemic issues about the selling of sex, the fact that, for example, there's mostly women who sell sex in the world, right? And there are lots of complicated stories about who's selling sex. Even if we set that aside, and so we can imagine places like in my country, which is like sort of happen to find oil and the same time of labor movements and women's rights movements, and so there's welfare state and all kinds of things, right? So you can imagine, perhaps, that there are conditions under which all this stuff has gone away, and some people want to sell sex, and all of that trouble is definitely away. Then I think on this account, yeah, but it would explain why, even in that case, it is morally dangerous. That accounts explain that. But even if, okay, maybe some people would want to do that. It would still be the case that you must have a right to change your mind. So it must be the case that if you're buying sexual services from me, I can always stop. And that's the end of that story. Maybe we can go and have a discussion afterwards of how much money I should give back and whatever. But it couldn't be the case that you could say that I gave you that money. It couldn't be the case, because I could never give you that. I could never give you my person. just like on Kant's account, even if you get me to sign a slave contract, is void. No court can recognize it. You're not allowed to give up your personhood. If it is the case that you want to give that up, and you really seriously do want to give it up, it will never be enforceable. In fact, if you keep on doing that, we might be a little bit worried, right, that you're not able to be responsible anymore. But still, it wouldn't be a void contract. It would never not be void. Would not be recognized. Couldn't be on this account. And it would, I think, show that practice of why it is the case that that one leaves the money ahead of time, because there's a sense in which, and then, like when one sells sex, I think one leaves the money ahead of time, right? But it isn't the case, and then we can take it or not, but you can also take it, yeah. So this way in which one tries to deal with these phenomena. So I hope. Did that answer?
Answer the question. I don't know if I can answer the question.
But it's why, so because, yeah. So this account, a lot writes on whether or not he is right to think there cannot be a slave contract that is enforceable, right? And this embodiment argument. If you add this stuff, right, then you can add a lot of arguments about why it is the case that being subject to somebody's sexual violence in that way, right, when after you said no, is emotionally so damaging for human beings, right? Because it can actually get to your sense of being safe in the world, in your own body, right? And so if this story is true, then it shows something about why, not just why we ought to take it so seriously, but why it's so heinous to do it. Because the way in which it affects us, right? But that argument would hold on its own, but this just isn't a way to explain why it's so serious. So why sexual crimes are more heinous than others. Mm-hmm.
So about the beautiful and the sublime.
Yeah.
I think I understand how Kant, what he equates as like the woman's use of allure and like drawing one to her equates or like relates to the beautiful, but I'm confused about how a man's or anyone's force relates to the sublime.
So Kant, so I think that he thinks something like this. So we don't need to have this complementarity for the argument to work at all, of course. Like femme can be femme, femme on femme, and whatever, right? So, but the way in which I think he thinks of it is this way in which the way for, I'll just use this argument straightforward, women to experience the sublime in this embodied way, in sexual encounters, is through the man. And then the way for the man to experience beauty in this way is through the woman. And so there's something about that playful interaction that was just supposed to give each other an experience that they cannot themselves do on their own. And so the sublime for Kant is this sense in which, waterfalls or, big things, or forcefulness. So it would track sort of more silly language, but sort of taking and being taken, right? So there's ways in which you sort of, still, this is all stereotypes now, right? But there's a way in which sort of there's a taken and being taken, but this experiences both as actually something you want, right? So sort of wanting that taking is something, and there's a sense in which for Kant, they both dominate. Like, it's not the case that one dominates and the other one not, if they are in control of each other's desires. And so wanting to be taken is still want to be taken in such a way that you're in control of the force, right? And so he argues the puzzle is why men want to subject themselves to women, because they do, right? So they want to subject that forcefulness to the control of the woman, and that's what is puzzling, right? And he thinks that, put it differently, if you're on the femme side of things, and you are attracted to a difference in this regard, then there's a way in which you have he would call it a social IQ, which is just much bigger. So you know how to draw somebody in that way and make them want to be drawn to you, and so to say, to give themselves over to you, right? And so for him, that is the puzzle. Did that help?
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of it as experiential, so that
Right. Yeah?
Thank you for your talk. That's great. I'm thinking about the beautiful and the sublime also, and also thinking about your example of the sort of tomboy in the way that gender nonconformity is maybe circulating within this dichotomy between beautiful and the sublime, especially in a contemporary moment in which the sort of social justice movement is thinking about, hashtag trans is beautiful. Well, simultaneously, part of the problem is that trans is perhaps sublime, and that's perhaps where sustained violence against trans people comes from. And so I'm curious where you, in this sort of gender dichotomy between beautiful and sublime, you see trans fitting into this.
Yeah. So for me, part of what wasn't clear in my response, I hear from the question, I actually think he's wrong about the dichotomy, right? So it's not true. Again, you can just let people be who they are, and who they find complements them is not going to follow the dichotomy. And in fact, for Kant himself, it didn't, right? His big love was, I take it any plausible interpretation, was a man, with whom he lived a lot of his life in ways in which you could do in Königsberg. But it probably also explains some of his homophobia, right? So why is so... It's the only thing where you have like panic attacks in Kant's text. Like Kant doesn't really panic when he writes philosophy. The only thing he does it about is sex. But more interestingly, so part of what I like about this account is whether whatever one wants, whichever complexity in LGBTQIA, yeah, is that this, if this is not too bad, but you unhook it from the ways in which he sort of made it track traditional men and women, that stuff. And instead you say, well, okay, so you get a new option for how to understand sexuality. Because what is going on here is for Kant not science, right? Kant thinks the first critique, which is not on the board at all, the first critique for Kant is an account of how to explain things out there in the world. How we get science, right? How we get these natural laws, no exception, how we can fly to the moon, whatever it is, right? That's the first critique. That one is the second critique, but everything about freedom. How do we realize freedom? Well, in this way. If you look at a lot of the literature on LGBTQIA, so all the sexuality, trying to understand sexual orientation, sexual identities, then you see that often they want to defend one out of two. It's choice, right? It's lived life, one way or another. So it's choice, ultimately, often hindered choice, but ultimately it's choice, or it's some sort of essence. So you have some scientists there looking for the gay gene, right, or whatever it is. Right? So somehow they're going to find that thing in science that explains all the instances. If this theory is right, they're never going to find that. Right? Because they're looking, so to say, in the wrong place, and they're looking for the wrong thing. But equally the case, for those who try to do everything with just choices, are also not going to find the answer. It never becomes visible how a lot of people will say that whether, for example, if I'm a gay or my tomboyness, if you want, if you will, is not just chosen. Right? There is something about my tomboyness that gets me right. And you can see it in little Helga, 4 years old, in the movies, and doing her thing and stuff. I mean, there's something about it that feels like me. Yeah? If this account is right, well, part of what feels like me is this way in which there is a forcefulness about me. You can call it sort of the vital force or whatever. But your own forcefulness, your embodied forcefulness, the way in which you feel yourself as a force, embodied force, that you can develop in ways that are going to be deeply consistent with who you are or not. But those ways will be explorable by the way in which you find that others can complement you, make you feel loved and seen, make you feel excited sexually, make you feel really beautiful, right, amazing, and so on and so forth. And the ways in which you like to be, both in the world, how you move in space and how people see you, but also how you like to be when you're very intimate. Yeah? And so it's arguing in this view. So not just that they can explain something about, some people really are quite on the gay side of things. They really are, right? I mean, it's not that they can't see. This account too can say that, well, you know, even those who are pretty much on the very gay side of things, right? Yeah, they can imagine having sex in different ways, and they can do it a little bit, but it's not what they want all the time. It's not kind of not the place they go. And why? Because the other thing is explosively much better, right? It's more who I am all the time. And then there are people who are really pretty bi, right? They like it all in a deep way. I mean, I'm bi, so always from my first personal point of view, I don't understand why not everybody's bi. It's like so much more fun, right? It is the rational position. Like, why not, right? But then I realized it isn't quite like that, is it now? But then I think it's the same with trans. On this view, you can explain trans, right? So you can explain this way in which there's a way in which you experience your own embodiment that doesn't fit with the kind of assignment of gender that you were given at birth, chosen on the basis of certain biological features. So you can feel deeply that there's a way in which you want to be able to be complemented by others sexually, right? You can feel deeply that there's a way in which you want to be able to see yourself in the mirror on your own that fits with how you feel beautiful, right? And so when you're getting these things right, you can explain this longing that, as I hear stories about trans, like finally, right? I'm doing the simple case now, but those who feel like that involves a full transitioning, finally, I'm in the world in the way in which I felt from my point of view that I've always been. If you do science, that is not possible to talk to, right? Because it isn't the case that it was there already or it is there already and so on and so forth. No, but you're looking for the wrong thing. What you're looking for is somebody's way of being, an embodied social being, that feels right from the first personal point of view. There's something to get right about yourself here. Yeah? And one way to say it is, so if you do full transitioning, so it involves changing some appearances, it can involve changing hormones, so it can involve many, many things about changing how you are in the world, how you see yourself, how you feel, what you can do in embodied ways. Yeah? Those things were not already there before transitioning. Literally those things. So you didn't already have the hormones. You didn't already have the changes you wanted. Yes? So you can't explain the longing, right? You couldn't explain the longing because it's not there already, but you know that that is what you want, and you are right. So in this account, then I'm thinking, well, this is a promising starting point because it can show how it is that these aspects of us are something that, A, nobody else can be an expert on, but it says something about which kinds of elements are involved. These ways in which we need to be in order to feel that we're living our own life. I'm sure there are ways to develop that, but notice too, it can speak to something that is, for me, a deep puzzle if you want to talk about sexuality, which is sexuality is one of those things, yeah? That if we can't develop it and integrate it and live it, we can become suicidal. It's that important to us, right? And yet, at the same time, if we can develop it, there's a sense in which the importance fades, in a sense. It sort of gets its proper place, yeah? But if you keep on being denied, so the last study, right? So at the moment, so one of the freest countries the planet has seen, 41% of people who identify as trans have tried to commit suicide at some point. Gay and lesbians, these numbers are between 10 and 20. For people who identify as straight and feel that they can be who they are, is about 5%. So you want to explain something that puts in the right existential importance, right? This is not just yet another thing you would like to do. This is something that if you can't realize it in the right way, it is the case that the world opens up as not being possible to live as your life, right? And this story is able to say something about that because it puts it here at the sort of very basic existential importance in our lives. And that's why, so it's one suggestion for why those numbers are as they are. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question about something a little bit different. When you were talking about moral feeling and you were talking about aggression, and that like every instance of aggression, encroaching upon someone else's freedom or limiting someone else's freedom. In this theory, is there any, like, I'm just thinking of like a parent pulling their kid from, a hot stove or something like that.
Yeah.
Those types of instances where you're ultimately doing what's good for the person, but you are limiting their freedom. Where does that fit in this theory?
Yeah, nice. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, stopping me from doing all the bad things I could do. Yes. No, well, so part of it is that the little child is not able yet to do this. It's also not able to do this. And so it's not yet able to govern itself by its own reason. And so we are stopping it, and we are obliged to stop it. We must stop it because it's not yet able to think about what it's doing and understand what it's doing. And so it doesn't mean that the child might not throw a tantrum. Kant thinks that because we are able to be free, like similar to the baby coming out screaming, so part of that screaming is the one that can sort of be developed into a passion for freedom. So we're all little monsters, right? So we have these moments, when we grow up, where we scream when we'd be taken away from the stove. And for Kant, that is the temptation of the passion of freedom, is that there's a longing to us, or a temptation, to be able to do whatever I want to do, rather than what I ought to do ultimately. That to be able to respond to, no, that's really stupid, right? And so you can see in the pulling back, the sort of, right? So which is the expression of freedom, but it's still your obligation because you're acting on behalf of the child. Yeah.
And then is there any parallel instance where it is an adult to an adult?
Yes, many also, but not involving force, right? So force in this view, we don't have a right to do with regard to one another. But it is the case that all of this, one fast one since I'm running out of time, but our biggest, first, and most complicated thing we have is a temptation to lie, to deceive ourselves and each other. Because we really want to be really good people, whole and unified and harmonious. I do mess up a little bit once in a while, but it's not a big deal. It's just a small thing. And so our first duty is truthfulness for Kant, right? And in my view, to get it right, you need to be truthful. And our loved ones, one of what they help us do is to deal with reality as it is. So they correct us, right? And we have the duty to do that, even though we hate it in important ways, right? And we can feel very ashamed, powerless, right? I didn't do that. Well, you really did. Yeah, right? And it's also on this account why forgiveness is so important. So when you hold me accountable, right, you did that to me. Then there's a sense in which I sort of have to say, yeah, right? And I'm so sorry. And when you forgive me on this account, it means that afterwards you're just as emotionally open to me as before I did wrong. And that's part of why it's so important to you to have forgiveness from one's friends, because it's the way in which we learn to develop, right? Become emotionally more healthy and not be completely devastated every time we mess it up, which we do all the time. And so it's important for us to have forgiveness because it makes it easier for me from my first personal point of view to do the right thing and to grow. Because I didn't lose you, right? There you are, and you still love me, you're still open. As if it didn't happen, in a sense, but not forgotten. Shouldn't forgive forever.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.